Marin stood on the porch of his farmhouse, the Sunday sun still warming the wood beneath his boots, when his son's words cut him deeper than any blade. "Dad, you're an ignorant hillbilly who wasted his life playing in the dirt. While I'm moving millions on Wall Street, you're out here planting corn like some primitive from the last century. I'm embarrassed to even tell my colleagues that my father is just a farmer." The words echoed in Marin's chest, stealing the air from his lungs. For 42 years he had risen before dawn, rain or shine, working the land his grandfather had purchased with sweat and stubbornness. And now the boy he had raised on that very soil, the boy who once sat proudly behind the wheel of a tractor before he could even balance on a bicycle, stood before him calling him primitive. Marin did not argue. He did not plead. Instead, he removed his sun-worn hat, placed it in his son's hands and said quietly, "Then you take care of it." The next morning, at precisely 8 o'clock, Marin dialed the number of a real estate broker. Within a week, the 1,200 acres of farmland that 3 generations of his family had cultivated were sold to a corporation for $4.2 million. Neighbors whispered in disbelief. Friends asked why. But Marin kept his reasons close. The land his grandfather had tilled, his father had expanded, and he had nurtured into prosperity was gone in 7 short days. The old farmer's silence masked a storm brewing within. His son Kalen believed farming was worthless, a relic of the past. Yet Marin knew the truth would reveal itself in time. He was a farmer, yes, but he also knew the power of land, and he knew the arrogance of men who measured worth only in dollars. Marin often thought back to his grandfather, a rail worker who in 1952 scraped together enough savings to buy 480 acres that most considered marginal ground. "A man who owns good soil owns a piece of eternity," Grandfather Joran used to say. His father, Reuben, carried the torch, expanding the land to 800 acres in the 1970s by hauling freight at night and farming by day. Reuben had little schooling, barely beyond 8th grade, but he possessed a genius for land and grit. Marin remembered him saying, "They don't make more land, but they always make more people. Hold on to land, son. It's the best investment there is." Those words guided Marin when he took over in 1982, after Reuben's first heart attack, turning the farm into a thriving 1,200-acre operation. He wasn't rich by city standards, but he was prosperous. More than that, he was a steward of a legacy. When Marin's wife, Ilara, was dying of breast cancer in 2018, her hand clutched his with fading strength. "Promise me," she whispered, her voice fragile as the autumn leaves outside the hospital window. "Promise me you'll teach Kalen to love this land the way we do. Teach him that honest work is worth more than any easy dollar." Marin had nodded, tears filling his weary eyes. Ilara was gone soon after, leaving behind not just grief, but a sacred vow. From that day, every furrow Marin plowed, every seed he pressed into the soil, carried her voice in his heart. He believed that one day Kalen would return and see the truth she spoke of, that the soil gave more than money ever could. It gave meaning. Kalen had been born into the rhythm of farm life. As a baby, his crib sat in the corner of the machine shed while Marin tinkered with tractors. When nightmares woke him, Marin carried him to the barn, where the hum of cattle and the grain elevator lulled him back to sleep. At 12, Kalen drove the combine without help for the first time, sprinting afterward to his mother, shouting with pride, "Mom, Dad says I'm a real farmer now." Marin poured his savings into his son's future. He and Ilara skipped vacations, wore patched clothes, and drove the same pickup for 12 years, all to save the $180,000 needed to send Kalen to the university. They dreamed of a son who would take their legacy and lead it into a brighter future. Marin had hoped Kalen's degree in agricultural business would bring him back to the soil with fresh ideas. He even bought modern equipment, GPS-guided tractors, soil sensors, and precision planters, so his son could learn the new ways during summer breaks. But after graduation, Kalen announced, "Dad, I'm taking a job in Chicago. I want to see agriculture from the financial side." Marin swallowed his disappointment and gave his blessing. If Wall Street would make him a sharper farmer one day, then so be it. But as the years rolled by, the city hardened Kalen. Promotions, bonuses, and expensive suits became his world. To Marin, each raise felt like another mile between them. By 2018, Kalen was living in New York, earning more in a year than the farm could gross. When he brought his girlfriend, Selena, to visit, Marin set the table with pork chops from his hogs, beans from Alara's old garden, and apple pie from their orchard. "This is food raised with care," he said proudly. Selena smiled politely but checked her phone between bites. Later, Marin overheard her whisper, "It's charming, but don't you think it's primitive? There are more efficient ways now." Kalen's reply stung worse than her question. "Yeah, Dad's old school. He hasn't really adapted." Marin carried the plates to the sink in silence, each word echoing louder than the clatter of dishes. The years that followed tested Marin's patience. Kalen rose through the ranks of Wall Street, while Marin tended the soil with aging hands and the help of his loyal farmhand, Jorn. In 2020, Kalen brought colleagues from the city to visit. They toured the fields like tourists, snapping photos with tractors as if they were museum relics. At supper, Marin served ribeye steaks and sweet corn. One guest chuckled, "Brad, sorry, Kalen, this is exactly like those outdated farms you show in your presentations. Feels like stepping back 50 years. Kalen laughed along, adding, "Yeah, my old man still thinks farming is about getting dirty instead of optimizing capital." They all roared with laughter. Marin smiled weakly, but inside something broke. For the first time, he wondered if his son no longer saw him as a father, but as a joke. In 2019, Marin prepared documents that would officially grant Kalen 30% ownership of the farm. He imagined them working side by side, blending his experience with Kalen's education and vision. One evening, over supper, Marin slid the papers across the table. "Son, I want you to have a stake in this land. You've got the knowledge, I've got the years. Together, we could make something lasting." Kalen barely glanced at the documents before pushing them back. "Dad, I appreciate it, but I can't tie my capital to one farm. I need diversification. My investments span asset classes across multiple markets. Owning farmland would be inefficient." He spoke as though he were addressing a client, not his father. Jorn, who had worked with Marin for decades, sat quietly at the table, his calloused hands frozen mid-bite. The rejection was not just financial, it was personal. After that night, Kalen began speaking of family farms as if they were doomed. "Small operations can't compete, Dad. You either scale up to thousands of acres or step aside for corporate agriculture. It's the only way forward." Marin listened in silence, but the words gnawed at him. To Kalen, the farm was an obsolete relic, a burden dressed in nostalgia. To Marin, it was a living heartbeat, a bond of soil and sweat that money could not measure. "Not everything is about efficiency, Kalen," Marin finally said one evening. "Some things are about belonging." But his son only shook his head, eyes already drifting toward his buzzing phone. That Labor Day, Kalen returned again, this time with 3 Wall Street colleagues in polished shoes and pressed shirts. They snapped photos beside tractors, joking about authentic rural America. At dinner, one leaned over his steak and whispered, "This is exactly like those small operations you dissect in your presentations, Kalen. Feels like a time capsule." Kalen laughed. "Yeah, my old man still thinks farming is about getting your hands dirty instead of managing assets." The laughter rippled around the table. Marin forced a smile, but inside his chest something tightened. He had endured droughts, storms, and loss, but nothing stung quite like being dismissed as irrelevant in his own kitchen. Later that evening, when the guests had gone to the porch with their drinks, Kalen lingered behind with his father. "Dad, you're sitting on real estate worth millions. Subdivide 40 acres at the back, sell development lots. You'd clear $2 million easy. Lease the rest to a corporation, and you'd never have to touch a tractor again. You're holding a gold mine and treating it like a vegetable garden." Marin's jaw tightened. "It's not a mine, Kalen. It's a community. Our neighbors depend on us. This isn't just dirt. It's lives." Kalen's tone sharpened. "Community is nice, Dad, but it doesn't pay retirement bills. You've got maybe 10 good years left. Then what? Do you expect me to come back and play farmer?" The words, spoken without hesitation, landed heavier than any storm. The conversation echoed in the same kitchen where Alara once baked cookies, where Kalen had sat as a boy coloring while Marin planned crop rotations. That room had carried the laughter of 3 generations, but now it carried only silence and bitterness. Marin stood at the window long after Kaylin left the room, staring at the fading horizon. He whispered into the quiet, as though Alara might still hear. I tried love. I tried to teach him, but maybe the soil doesn't speak to him anymore. The only response was the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the old clock above the door. In 2021, Marin's neighbor brought him a video posted on a professional network. It was Kaylin presenting at a financial conference. The title blazed across the screen. Inefficient capital allocation in family farming. Behind him flashed aerial photos of Marin's farm, his fields, his barns, his home. Kaylin dissected the farm as an example of poor economics, mocking sentimental decisions and suboptimal machinery use. The audience laughed and applauded. Thousands of strangers commented with ridicule about nostalgic farmers stuck in the past. And beneath their scorn, Kaylin had clicked like. When Marin finally reached his son by phone, his voice shook. You used our farm, our family, as a prop for your jokes. Kaylin's tone was flat. Dad, it wasn't personal. I didn't name you. I was just showing data. Data. Marin's voice cracked. That's our life's work. Your mother's last wish. And you laughed with them. There was a pause, then Kaylin replied coldly. Facts don't care about feelings, Dad. Sentiment doesn't change math. Small farms are obsolete. Marin lowered the phone slowly, staring at the floorboards. For the first time in his life, he felt ashamed not of his work, but of his own blood. By 2022, Kaylin's success soared. He drove luxury cars, wore watches worth more than tractors, and spoke of nothing but portfolios and markets. At Christmas, Marin showed him the farm's books. A record profit of $240,000 despite drought and shortages. Kaylin skimmed the numbers and scoffed. Dad, that's a 5.7% return on a $4.2 million asset. I made that last quarter in bonuses. You're running an expensive hobby. Marin clenched his fists. It's not just about returns. It's about feeding people. Kaylin leaned back, smirking. In the end, everything is about returns. You fix tractors. I engineer wealth. You're a mechanic. I'm an engineer. The words cut deeper than any insult. For the first time, Marin wondered if there was anything left between them but a hollow name. After Christmas, the farmhouse felt emptier than ever. Marin would walk into the kitchen and still hear echoes of Kaylin's dismissive tone. He found himself pausing in the barn, staring at the old combine, remembering when his boy once begged to ride in it every evening. Jorn tried to lift his spirits. Don't let his words break you, Marin. He's blinded by city lights. Soil's worth more than gold to a hungry man. But Marin only nodded. At night, he lay awake, replaying Kaylin's voice. You're just a mechanic. Until the words stung worse than the ache in his knees. In February 2023, Kaylin returned with 5 of his colleagues during Super Bowl weekend. They arrived on a rented party bus, laughing loudly as though they were tourists visiting a theme park. Marin prepared his finest meal. Smoked pork shoulder, cornbread from his grain, green bean casserole from his garden. The men snapped pictures for social media, tagging the farm like it was a quaint roadside attraction. At dinner, one of them smirked. Kaylin, this feels like a farming museum. Your dad should start charging admission. They roared with laughter. Kaylin joined in, adding, yeah, he still thinks farming is about tradition instead of capital optimization. Marin stared at his son that night, searching his face for a flicker of respect, but found only mockery. He felt the weight of 3 generations pressing on him. The sweat of his grandfather, the grit of his father, and the vow of his wife. And now, all of it had become entertainment for men who had never lifted a spade. He walked out to the porch while their laughter echoed inside, gripping the rail as if it were the only thing keeping him from crumbling. For the first time, he felt that Alara's last request, to teach Kaylin the value of the land, had slipped from his grasp forever. That night, Marin sat alone in the barn. Dust floated in the air like faded memories. He whispered, "What did I do wrong, Alara? Did I push him too hard, or not hard enough?" The barn creaked with silence. Jorn later found him still sitting on a bale of hay, staring at nothing. You can't change a man's heart, Maren, Jorn said gently. Sometimes the soil calls to one, but not to another. Maren sighed, heavy as stone. But he's my son. My blood. How do I accept that he despises the very thing that built him? Word spread quickly through Cedar Falls. Neighbors had seen the online video, and whispers carried at the feed store and church. Some pitied Maren, others shook their heads in quiet judgment. Imagine, your own son mocking you to the world, an old friend muttered one Sunday. Maren kept his head low, not out of shame for his farm, but for the fracture in his family. You can lose crops to drought and plant again, he told Jorn. But once you lose respect from your own child, what do you plant after that? Each morning, Maren walked the fields at dawn, the soil crunching under his boots. He remembered his father's words. They don't make more land, but they always make more people. Yet now people seem to value everything but land. Kalen's world of screens and numbers had no room for dirt-stained hands. Maren whispered to the empty horizon. This soil fed us, clothed us, built us. But to him, it's just an asset class. The rising sun painted the rose gold, but the warmth did not reach his heart. One evening, Maren sat at his old wooden desk and began writing a letter. Son, this land was never about money. It was about belonging. Your mother wanted you to love it, not mock it. One day you'll see that wealth without roots is emptiness. He wrote for hours, pouring his heart onto the page. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully, slid it into an envelope, and tucked it into his Bible. He never mailed it. Perhaps, he thought, the soil would deliver the message one day when words no longer could. By spring, Maren felt a quiet resolve growing. He could not force Kalen to value the farm, but he could decide its future. He walked the boundaries of the land, tracing the fence lines his grandfather had hammered, the fields his father had broken, the barns he himself had raised. If Kalen won't carry this legacy, then I must choose who will, he murmured. The thought brought him both pain and relief. The land deserved a steward who respected it. The soil had waited generations for hands that honored its worth. One afternoon, Maren received a visit from Loren, a young neighbor who had recently started farming with his wife. Mr. Maren, he said respectfully, removing his cap. If you ever think of retiring, I'd be honored to lease some of your ground. I may not have much, but I'll treat your soil like it's sacred. His words struck Maren. Sacred. That was the word he had been waiting years to hear. Unlike Kalen's talk of percentages and returns, Loren spoke with reverence. Maren studied the young man's calloused hands, and saw in him a reflection of his younger self. That night, Maren wrestled with a storm of emotions. Could he truly pass the land to someone outside his bloodline? Alara's voice echoed in his mind. Teach Kalen to love this land like we do. He had tried. He had failed. But maybe love for the soil did not always flow through blood. Maybe it lived wherever honest hands touched the ground. As thunder rolled in the distance, Maren realized the farm's future might not rest with his son. It was a thought both sorrowful and strangely freeing. In early summer, Kalen arrived unexpectedly, pulling up in a gleaming black car. He walked the fields in polished shoes, as though afraid of dirt. Dad, listen, he began. I've been looking at the numbers. Cedar Falls is expanding fast. Developers are hungry for land. If you sell, you could cash out big. I could even manage the money for you. We'd be set for life. Maren's jaw tightened. And what about the families who eat the food we grow? The workers who depend on these fields? Kalen shrugged. Dad, that's not your responsibility. Times change. For the first time, Maren's patience snapped. He slammed his hand on the kitchen table, rattling the salt shaker. Boy, you stand here on the soil that raised you, the soil your mother begged you to respect, and you talk of tearing it apart for profit. Do you hear yourself? Kalen recoiled, eyes narrowing. Dad, you're stuck in the past. You've wasted your life chasing dirt. The words, sharp and cold, hung in the air like a final verdict. Maren's chest ached, but he no longer argued. Silence became his shield. Later that evening, Jorn found Maren sitting on the porch, shoulders slumped. Don't let him break you, old friend, Jorn said softly. You've given him everything, your labor, your money, your faith. Some sons take, some sons turn away. But the land doesn't turn away. It still needs a keeper. Marin looked out across the darkened fields. Maybe it's time I give it to someone who'll listen. Jorn nodded, his weathered face calm. Then do it, Marin. Let the land choose its heir. Over the next weeks, Marin began drafting papers quietly. He met with a lawyer in town, not to sell the land to corporations, but to prepare a transfer of lease to Loren, the young neighbor. Loren and his wife wept when Marin told them. We'll care for it, sir, Loren promised. We'll make sure your wife's garden grows again. Marin felt a warmth he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he saw a future for the farm beyond himself, and beyond Kalen. When Kalen discovered the arrangement, he stormed into the farmhouse, anger flashing in his eyes. You're giving it away to some outsider? After everything I've done, after all the money I've made? That land is worth millions, Dad. Marin stood firm, his voice calm. It's not about millions. It's about meaning. You had your chance, son. You chose a different path. Kalen scoffed. So you'd rather hand it to a stranger than your own blood? Marin's eyes glistened, but his voice did not waver. Blood is not enough without respect. The argument ended with Kalen slamming the door, his luxury car roaring down the gravel road in a cloud of dust. Marin stood at the window, heart heavy yet strangely unburdened. For the first time, he no longer clung to the hope that his son would change. The land had chosen. Loren would honor it, care for it, pass it forward with gratitude. Marin whispered into the quiet. Elara, I kept my promise. I taught him, but he would not learn. Now the soil will teach another. Autumn came, painting the fields gold. Marin walked the rows with Loren and his wife, showing them the soil's quirks, the way the low ground stayed damp after rain, the corner where corn thrived best. As they listened with reverence, he felt a peace settle in his chest. The farm was no longer his burden alone. It would live on, not through blood, but through devotion. For the first time in years, the land felt light beneath his boots, as though it too had breathed a sigh of relief. Meanwhile, Kalen called less often. When he did, his words were clipped, full of market jargon and business trips. He never asked about the harvest, never about the soil. Marin no longer tried to explain. Their conversations became like two men living on opposite planets, one rooted, one drifting. Sometimes, Marin missed the boy who once shouted with joy from a combine cab, but he knew that boy was gone. Kalen had chosen numbers over soil, and Marin had accepted the cost. On a quiet evening, Marin sat on the porch, watching the sun sink over the horizon. Jorn rocked beside him, silent as ever. The field stretched wide, whispering with the promise of another season. Marin closed his eyes and whispered, Elara, it's done. The land is safe. The crickets sang, the soil breathed, and the night wrapped him in peace. He had not saved his son from arrogance, but he had saved the legacy from oblivion. In the end, the farm remained, steady as the earth itself, outlasting pride, outlasting pain, and ready to feed another generation that would love it.
Every story carries a lesson. If this one moved you, tap subscribe so you never miss the next twist in the journey.